Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience for the broad front that we need to win. This week on the show, my guests are the co-editors and co-authors of Lawyering for Liberation, a toolbox for movement lawyers, Ameca, Reali, and Marbré Stahly-Butts. We'll discuss both how lawyers and organizers can use the book to better understand the intersections of the legal system and liberation work, as well as how those working in law can best align themselves with movements. But first, these headlines. The voter suppression bill known as the, quote, Save America Act is expected to go to a vote in the Senate this week. If you're not already aware, this egregious bill is an effort by MAGA to suppress voting by imposing some major and really expensive mandates on counties that are managing elections. The passage of this law will result in many voters being disenfranchised. It demands much more strict voter identification and citizenship re-verification than most states currently require. While this bill has been in the pipeline for some time, it is one of the last major moves that MAGA has left to play in its quest to permanently consolidate power as an authoritarian movement. If you live in a state with a senator who might be swayed, who might be on the fence, now's a great time to flood them with calls to vote no. The trial of 9 activists in Texas under the new, quote, domestic terror designation for anti-fascist organizers concluded last week, resulting in some convictions on Friday. The charges stemmed from a noise demonstration outside the Prairiland ICE detention facility on July 4th, 2025, during which shots were fired and a correctional officer was shot by a protester who was illegally carrying a firearm. 8 of the defendants were found guilty of, quote, material support for terrorism because they showed up to the demonstration wearing all black. Some of them were also convicted of conspiracy to conceal documents because they moved some boxes of zines. The prosecution on this case was really a test balloon for what the federal government can now get organizers for. I think it says a lot that one of the, quote, expert witnesses the prosecution called was Kyle Schittler, who works at the Center for Security Policy, which is a right-wing think tank that is so Islamophobic that the Southern Poverty Law Center has categorized it as a hate group. Schittler was allowed to testify against the defense's objections and claimed that many of the group's actions were, quote, hallmarks of Antifa cells. This is, frankly, ridiculous. One of those so-called hallmarks was using Signal to communicate, which Schittler then also admitted to using himself, and that we, unfortunately, know that Secretary of War Pete Hegseth also uses too. The absolute lack of basis here is notable, and while this is the first prosecution of its kind, it certainly won't be the last.
Hey everybody, this is Maurice Mitchell, National Director of the Working Families Party. I read and give to Convergence because it has become a home for me to engage in critical analysis, find practical advice for organizing and strategy, and inspiration in the belief that a better world is not only possible, we can build it.
To make either a one-time donation or become a sustaining member, visit convergencemag.com/donate. You can find a direct link in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
Social movements are often centered around the law, who it protects and who it does not. And as you heard in our headlines, we also find ourselves in a time when there is increasing weaponized lawfare waged by MAGA and its allies. Aside from the Antifa domestic terror case in Texas, we've also seen other brazen attempts by the federal government to criminalize dissent, whether we're talking about the RICO cases against Atlanta's Stop Cop City movement or the more recent charges against protesters in Minnesota this winter. Some forms of legal representation for these cases and others is deeply necessary as the systems of power which marginalize these communities in the first place seek to criminalize our work towards liberation. This is the work of movement lawyering. Movement lawyering is when attorneys and other legal professionals align their work with the values and politics of movements for liberation. Our guests today have recently published a guide and a handbook for legal professionals and organizers alike. I was recently joined by the co-authors and co-editors of Lawyering for Liberation, a toolbox for movement lawyers. My guests are movement attorney Ameca Reali and associate professor of law at CUNY School of Law, Marbré Stahly-Butts. We discussed the work lawyers need to do to bring their work and values into alignment with liberation movements, as well as how organizers can think about how to work closely with legal professionals who share their goals. Take a listen. All right, Ameca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Caden. I appreciate it.
Definitely. And Marbré, thanks for being with us as well.
It's a pleasure to be here.
To start us off, I think that a lot of folks in our audience probably have some concept of what movement lawyering might be, but I would like to start just defining our terms here and why you wrote the book, what you mean by movement lawyering in the book, and what you hope both lawyers and organizers can come to understand about the concept through reading and working through the book. Ameca, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So this book really came about because Marbré and I were working at Law for Black Lives together for about 5 years. Some of that time included through 2020 when things started to get a little crazy and there were lots of uprisings and lots of people in the streets and COVID and all these things happening at the same time. But we had been training for quite a while as a function of our roles at Law for Black Lives, training lawyers who were really interested in understanding movement lawyering. They were interested in the tactics that movement lawyers used and how they could apply them either inside of their institutions or even in their work outside of those institutions. And we were a place that really thought long and hard about how that should happen. And so we were training a lot, I would say hundreds of lawyers. And we thought, wow, this should be in one place. There should be a place to access all of the different iterations of the trainings that we've done because they're really powerful and they're moving and they're really helpful. At least that was the feedback we were getting. And we really felt like we wanted to offer this to the field, but also to the world. And we wrote this or started writing this a while ago. And then things just really went haywire even more, I think, after 2020. And it became really important to bring this into the world because we knew it would be a useful tool. The way that I think about movement lawyering, I don't think of it as like a status. I don't think of it as a static place. I think of it as lawyers really committing to using their skills, their knowledge, their understanding of the law to advance the power of movements and not to build the power of the law or to reinforce the status quo. That in its most simplest terms is how I think of it. And I think of it as a set of tools and practices that you are always learning how to use and deploy and to sharpen. And the only other thing I would say is a really distinct part of movement lawyering, besides that your commitment to building the power of movement, is to also having a really sharp political analysis about the systems that you're fighting against and the types of freedom and liberation that the movements you're working for and with are trying to achieve.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Marbré, is there anything that you want to add about the origin story of the book or kind of like how you personally also define and think about movement lawyering?
The only thing I would add is, and there's the chapter on this in the book, which is I think a key piece of movement lawyering is a honed belief about how you think change happens. And so much of lawyering, so much of what lawyers are asked to do implicitly assumes that most change happens through the courts or happens through lawmaking or happens if people in power make different decisions, whether that's through lobbying or through like being super persuasive in a brief. And I think at the heart, at the core of progressive movement lawyering is this idea that the way that change happens, if we want to build a world in which people who are currently being exploited by or harmed by the law and by society are empowered, are able to thrive, that only happens when those people are able to organize themselves to make demands that address the material needs and to shift power so that ultimately they are the ones who are making decisions and enacting the future they want to see. And so I think that, Ameca said this, that, the kind of heart of movement lawyering is using the law to build power for social movements. But part of that is a profound belief that the law is only one of many tools that create change. And in many cases, it is a slow and ineffectual tool. And that doesn't mean, I don't mean to say that there are not times when the law is 100% necessary. We see the law as a tool of mitigation and create space for folks to be out of cages and in their homes so that we can do the organizing work that's so important. But I think this idea that actually, like, if you are a lawyer who thinks that change happens in a courtroom, then you give all of your attention, all of your effort to a courtroom. If you're a lawyer who thinks change happens because people are able to organize themselves and demand condition changes and to shift power, then you think of the courtroom as kind of one arena, but not the main one. And so I think that's the only thing I would add is this, it's a honed politic, but it's also a clarity about how you think change happens and where your attention and your time is going. And so the way we then measure whether or not you're a good movement lawyer isn't if you run all your cases, it's whether or not your practice builds power.
Yeah, no, that's really rich because I think one of the things that as a person who I don't have a technical background in the law, but I do have a technical background with technology, right? And so like one of the things I think a lot about as a movement technologist is like, how do we as people who are seen as experts in something, as technical experts in something, right? Whether we're credentialed or not, like relate to people who are not credentialed but have expertise of their own. And how do we build this self-awareness to like steward our highly technical field in ways that like support those movements without over indexing towards like kind of what I would almost call a cult of expertise, right? It's like we think that just because somebody has some extra letters behind their name or have built X or Y tool that somehow they are more important. And that can come up in these like subtle and interpersonal ways. And so I'm really interested in unpacking a little bit of like some of that dynamic too, that there's like a piece of this that is very much about personal transformation. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the things that you've learned about this sort of like what it's like to be a quote unquote expert who's in service to social movements, right? That like, what are the sort of like personal things that maybe each of you have gone through as part of that process? Because I think it's really important.
It's such a good point. Just as you were talking, this doesn't directly answer the question, although I will. But I think a lot about that, like the Aristotle quote, like if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail.
Mm-hmm.
And this sense that if your expertise define you, then you think that the only way to solve problems, if you're in tech, is a tech solution. If you're a lawyer, it's a lawyer solution. And so I think there's like a profound humility that's so necessary for lawyering, because the law really is the language and the tool of the elite and of those who have power. And I think we have to be really clear in our understanding of history, in our understanding of the law, that it was created as a tool to maintain, legitimize, and naturalize power. That's been what the law has always been. And especially in the United States, which is a country that created property rights based on indigenous genocide and land theft, that created ideas around property based on chattel slavery. Like these are like literally the law was created to justify the theft of land and the use of bodies and people as slaves. And so I think we have to be so skeptical about what the law can offer us, while also recognizing that it's the currency by which people can get the freedom and maintain the freedom. It's the currency by which we can hold, at least in some ways, people to account. And so I think, one of the kind of personal qualities I think is so important in a movement lawyer is a profound sense of humility. And I think, I often tell the story that I think I was first introduced to this idea of movement lawyering in law school, but my reference point was mostly honestly like older, really dope, but older white men who were like, I am from this privileged place and I go into these movement spaces full of Black and brown people, and I have to go in as kind of like a humble servant who's there to translate these legal concepts. And I think there's something very powerful about being in service of movements that you may not be part of. But my experience even from that time was as somebody who was from these communities, who wanted to lawyer as part of movement, not adjacent to movement, not like helicoptering into movement, that I really saw myself as part of. And I come from a lineage of people who fought for Black liberation in different ways. And so I saw my work as a lawyer as part of that. And I think, I spent the first year or so in law school, maybe more, being kind of despondent in realizing that the law was not going to be the tool of liberation that I thought it was. And I think I didn't come to a place of kind of feeling powerful, hopeful about the law until 2015. And and 16 when Ferguson happened, when here in New York, Oregano happened. And what I realized was that actually, if I'm part of movement and that if the law is just the tactical vehicle that I can contribute, but actually my identity, my community is defined by this shared goal of all collective liberation, that if that is where my identity is drawn from, I can rely on and use this tool of the law that I've learned and that I've honed in law school without it defining me. And if I have that relationship to this tool, then I can pick it up and let it go as necessary. And so there are some spaces that I go into where my highest purpose and use is to put away chairs and to like make sure everyone has coffee and to have an awkward conversation with somebody who didn't like how we facilitated the space. And there are times when my highest purpose is to figure out what your legal policy approach to this is, or to, stand up in court with somebody when they've been arrested. And so I think there's this real sense of being agile and being humble. The other thing I think, the kind of personal piece that's been so important for me is there's an amazing organizer and thinker named Mary Hooks, who talks about, she calls it kind of the mandate for Black people in this time. And the last line of that is to be transformed in the service of the work. And it reminds me of actually Stuart Hall writes about, he writes in one of his pieces about how, if you agree with everything that you wrote a year ago, if there isn't 20 or 30% that you disagree with now, you're not doing the work of assessing and evolving your political thought. And so I think there really is this sense that, the law, as a movement lawyer, you should be constantly open to and willing to be transformed in the service of this work. And so as conditions change, our assessments must change, the tools we use must change. And if you think your identity is completely defined by your lawyerness, by your ability to stand up in court and represent somebody, that you really are missing the biggest piece of the puzzle about what your contributions might look like.
Yeah, wow, that was like a whole sermon, Mar.
I know, that was fire.
Yes.
I was like, did I answer the question though?
Yeah. And then some.
What really resonates with me about what you said, Marbré, and of course you and I have talked about this quite a bit, is that I never came into this work feeling like I was going to save anybody with the law. I just really wanted access, because I saw how negatively people around me that I loved were impacted by how the law works. And I felt like, or at least my motivation at the time was, at least I can learn this language. At least I can learn how this system works. At least I can be on the inside, because there's something that I can do to be able to help those I love. And every evolution of my career has come out of me unlearning something and learning a little bit more about my place in the collective and how our liberation is tied to one another. And so most of what I do, or most of how I find myself or have found myself in movement learning spaces, is just out of a desire to be of service to people who I see myself connected to and tied to. So it's really interesting that I wrote a book about this, because I wasn't some sort of movement lawyering academic. And quite frankly, my exposure even to old white men who were movement lawyers was very limited. I just really took a lot of inspiration from people around me. And I think about one specific turn in my career. I was in law school. The first year was awful. It was like a hazing. I questioned a lot why I even spent the money to put myself through it. And I met a person named John Thompson, who was on death row in Louisiana for decades, was almost put to death, and then was granted his freedom and exonerated. And he was coming around to law schools talking about what that experience was to him and how he was using it to bring people to this place in New Orleans where they could find a home, and how he was pushing the state to be more accountable for the way that DA showed up. And for me, that changed my life. It made me realize that people impacted by these systems could actually do something for themselves. And really all I needed to do was ask him how I could help him. And at every point in my career, I feel like I have been led by this question of how can I help? What can I do? How can I show up? Versus how can I be some rock star lawyer who saves everybody's life? So I would just say that has really guided my own personal journey. And I'm grateful that all of those experiences led us to this book and to putting all of that together, because I think it does help folks like Marbré and I and others who are in law school feeling this way to find something that they might be able to hold on to latch on to, and feel like they can stand in their power and also be lawyers, which sometimes feels hard and conflicting and
Yeah.
maybe not even possible at times.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that struck me reading it was like thinking about this as also, this is not a super academic book. Like there are these like reflective exercises helping people think through what their own values are, how they might apply those things. And I feel like even like this sort of spirit of humility and questioning what is happening and what you are, like what systems you are involving yourself in, it's like shot through in the form of the book, not just the content, which I think is really cool. I also think that, you know, this emphasis on values is super important. And like, I'm curious, I think that the sort of values that are at the core of the writing and the things that you write about, like what are the movement values that you bring to lawyering and legal work, are super important. So I'd love to talk a little bit about that. And I think like there is something sort of unique about the practice of law and the fact that, you know, as you mentioned, Marbré, like a lot of these systems are set up explicitly to protect private property, to like paper over inequality, to make it like create cover for the powerful and the wealthy. And yeah, I'm curious about the conversations also that kind of led you into writing the chapters on values, and obviously also talk a little bit about what those values are and how you see that showing up in your work.
A part of what is like in the special sauce that Law for Black Lives offers to the field is just how explicit we are and were about our politics, about the fact that we were seeking to support efforts toward Black liberation and all types of liberation that were aligned, and that we needed to understand, quite frankly, how we got to the place that Black people were so oppressed and so marginalized and feeling so powerless. Before we could even attack the problems, we often quoted Ella Baker about radical being, you know, just getting down to the root. And understanding and sharpening your political analysis is getting down to the root, right? Understanding racialized capitalism as you are fighting against the prison industrial complex is kind of key.
Yeah.
Right? You have
Yeah.
to understand how that is rooted inside of our system of punishment and mass incarceration to even start to unwind it, and to understand what levers to push to get free. And so, yeah, I think it's a part of a responsibility as a movement lawyer to really not only sharpen your political analysis, but then hold on to a sort of set of values that you think are essential to keeping you tied to movement, but also to keeping you ready to be a resource to movement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, in addition, as usual, I think agree with Ameca completely about just this real need to be grounded in a set of values. I think two additional thoughts. One is, I think part of this conversation around explicitly naming not just our values, which are values around like love and respect and community, and power sharing and equality, but also, as Mika said, like explicitly our politics, like Law for Black Lives. It's important that through our values and our political assessments, we are abolitionists, we are Black queer feminists. Like these are, we are anti-capitalists. Like these are important, I think, strains to name. And I think they're important strategically because the kinds of decisions, I said this to my students at the time, if you're not clear on how you think change happens and the vision of the world you're fighting for, whatever work you put in will be work into the status quo. That it will end up complementing, securing the system more inside of, and you'll become complicit, whether or not you mean to be or not. And so I think this idea of being explicit and clear in your political assessment is so important, because the work of movement lawyering looks the same as the work of non-movement lawyering. The difference is the why and the with who. And so I think this question of like, what are the values that motivate you is strategically essential, because you make different choices if you're clear about your political goals and outcomes. I think it's also sustainable that, for me at least, especially, I've been, kind of active in movement work for like 12 years now as a lawyer. And in those 12 years, I've seen just profound, like, ups and profound downs, one of which we are currently inside of. And just in case someone was wondering. And I think, for me, what has been sustainable is being in community with people who are organizers and who share my political perspective, but more than that, my values. And so in the same way, like, I grew up, my grandma was a preacher, and the church was a community that sustained her in hard times. I think the same thing in my political home. And the idea that actually, it's in sharing like our values and in honing our politics, that even when things are really bad, when it feels difficult to imagine a way out for our future and our children and our nieces and our nephews and people that we love, that it's actually through relationships and through shared values that we're able to do that. And so I think that is really important. I also think, we're taught this master hegemonic lie in law school, and it's explicit in law school, but it actually is taught every place, that the law is neutral, that the law is apolitical, that the systems that were underneath, if they're a little bit racist, it's just because of like a bad decision maker or some implicit bias. Like, it's a mistake that can be cured with a little kind of just a small shift, like a small change, a tweak of the system. And I think part of embracing a radical politic, and again, as Ameca said, radical meaning grasping at the roots, not just like solving the same symptoms over and over again without addressing the root causes, is to understand that the law is deeply and profoundly political. And that if we're going to act inside of that, we have to make a decision about our political orientation to it. And so either we are complicit in it or we are against it. And so I think this goes to what I said earlier, but I think there really is that your politics help you understand that. And if you think of the law as neutral, then you are complicit in the problem. And so, I think it also, though, is a discipline that sustaining our values and sustaining our political orientation, especially in moments of, retrenchment, and when we're seeing backlash, and when we're seeing these systems escalate, that it is a decision you have to make about, like, I will lean into and I will embrace and I will find community inside of my values and my politics, even though, right, the world is aflame.
I think the sort of relational nature of the whole way also that you structured the book, right? With like these quick interviews with practitioners, and then also that it's like both a book that you have written together and also a book you've edited together. I think like a lot of that comes through in sort of the writing as well. To that point, one of the things I did want to get to is that, I think that a lot of people might look at this book and be like, great, well, this is a resource for the people that I know or that who are in my life who are legal professionals. But it also strikes me that this is also a resource for organizers who are not legal professionals, who might be thinking about, how do we want to shape a relationship with the movement lawyers that we work with? How do we want to approach legal strategies? So for that side of our audience who are non-lawyers, what are the lessons in the book that you would want them to pull out? And what are the things that you think that they should be looking for in their partners that are in the book that they can learn from?
When writing, I'm not sure I was thinking that the audience was only for law students. And I don't want to purport to be teaching organizers anything. I think it's actually the other way around. Lawyers, and myself included, have learned so much from organizers about how to see the world differently, about the possibilities of different ways of being with each other and with the planet, how deeply you can apply your care and your love for humanity. So I just want to preface this by saying that. But I also know that sometimes buzzwords come up and people apply perhaps movement lawyering to themselves or the work that they're doing, and they haven't quite gotten a grasp of the concepts. Or maybe they haven't read our book, or maybe they don't know any movement lawyers or organizers for that matter. And I think it's a great way for people who aren't practicing law or aren't showing up in movement as lawyers and legal professionals to sort of understand how those who they invite in the space should be showing up. Even if you can't put words to it, even if you don't know it from the other side, you're like, oh yeah, we should have relationships of accountability with you. You should be really honest with us. Who are the people you're talking to that are holding you accountable besides us? Who is your team that you bring this back to? How do you believe change happens? I think those are really great spaces to start in conversation with people who you want to invite into your space, so that if they aren't using movement learning tactics, if they aren't quite there yet, at least you can say, hey, I don't think you're ready. Come back when your theory of change is a little different, or come back when you can show me how you're going to be in relationship with me in a way that is non-hierarchical. So I think there are some really great tools for organizers or even folks who aren't practicing law inside of movement to gauge the presence of folks who do say they are there for that. I also think there is a lot in the lessons. The second half of the book offers these really beautiful accounts of how lawyers, legal workers, and even some organizers have wrestled with the really, really hard questions and tensions that come up inside of movement work. It can be messy. It's not all in a cute, tight, neat little package. And it does require us to talk to each other and work through really hard and difficult things with each other. And it, to me, feels really good to hear and see and read the accounts of people who have gone through that and come out the other side. And they're not ashamed to talk about it. There's not shame. There's just like, this is what happened. Either I was right or I was wrong, or I was somewhere in the middle, but this is what I did to get through that. This is who I talked to. Now that I have a little bit of perspective, these are the lessons I'm taking with me. I think that's really beautiful. And it gives permission for your work with each other to be messy and not always clean and not always perfect, but perhaps transformative, if you can get to the other side or get through that.
Well, I am curious to hear about some of those case studies and stories. If there's if there are particular ones that you want to share with our audience that were like particularly profound for you. Yeah, Marbré, you look very excited about a particular story.
I just agree with Ameca, because I think I also had this sense of like, when we were writing the book, I thought of the book as being for folks who are interested in using the law as a tool. But even as you asked the question, like so many, like if you're engaging in at least like, non-reformist reforms, you're trying to really engage the system, then you are having to grapple with the limits of and the like possibilities of and the, the harms of the law. And so when I think about the use of that, I think part of what you said is it really, this is completely, as Ameca said at the beginning, it's essentially our training in a book form. And so our trainings were really meant to allow folks some space to engage in reflection, to think about their strategy, to, so often when we are, whether we're lawyering or, doing other forms of work and organizing, we're just moving so much. And I think especially in the legal field, there aren't enough postmortems. There aren't enough, like, outside of, like, a specific legal strategy, we aren't asking questions about the movement or our own behavior. There's so few checks on our ethics. So I think that, it feels like the book offers this kind of chance to sit with these questions and an invitation to think about, like, what is your assessment? What is the theory of change? What are the ways that brings you into the work? And so I was amening that, but I also absolutely, my favorite part of the book, no offense to Ameca or I, is the last half, where just honestly, like over 20 like fucking brilliant, mostly lawyers, but also some organizers who have like decades and decades of experience, write about that experience through this lens of like, what have I learned as a movement lawyer? What has my work done to contribute to or build the power of movement? And so I think whatever your orientation is, if you're doing work that involves law as a strategy, these are really valuable lessons. And the ones for me that kind of stand out that I'll mention, There was a number of reflections on 2015 and 16 and 2020. And I guess partly because this is when I came of kind of age inside of the movement, these reflections are especially important to me. And I think because they're just so clearly a predecessor to this moment that we're in, this retrenchment moment, that I feel like there hasn't been enough for me work of really thinking about what did we do right? What did we do wrong? What are lessons we should take from those? And so I think all of the pieces, Purvi Shah's piece, Amon Freeman's piece about Baltimore, Purvi Shah wrote about Ferguson, reading, Vince Warren's piece, even, Zhu Young, who's one of, I think, the most brilliant organizers, was in charge of CPR here in New York that led to the end of, not the end of, stop and frisk continues, but led to the litigation win in the Floyd case, and then a series of city council bills that essentially curtailed stop and frisk, reflects on how the legal process and the settlement process essentially undid those victories, and how this dependence, right, on settlement, on thinking about the law as the arbitrator of your demands, is incredibly problematic because of who gets to control those processes. And so I think these are like the instruction of that. And Ju Young's advice isn't not to sue the police. It isn't not to engage in lawsuits. It's to think really carefully about the power imbalances that happens when you win. And not even when you lose, when you win. And so I think those kinds of questions feel so important. Back to part of what Ameca said about the necessity of a strong political and values-based understanding. Gina Clayton-Johnson's piece about Black queer feminism and what it means to be a Black queer feminist, what kind of campaigns, what kind of legal fights you have, what is like the kind of heart of Black queer feminism in this value of collective care and love. What does that look like in a legal practice? What does that look like in an organizing practice? That's such a profound, I think, lesson. And then one of my other favorites is Gina Shaw, who is a professor, writes about racial capitalism and the pedagogy of law school. Like, what does it mean that we train lawyers to accept and to embrace in many ways? The relationship between law and capital is a storied one. And if we talk about the law as being the architect of injustice, it certainly has been the protector of capital. And so how do we indoctrinate our students to understand that relationship and to fight it? And so those are some of my favorites, but I think there's such a rich depth, some very tactical. Joey Mogo writes about reparations in Chicago. Christian Snow writes about how to navigate coalitions that are led by advocacy groups that don't have any base. I think that all of these are really wherever you stand, whatever kind of lawyer you are, whether you're an organizer, these are important questions we grapple with, and these smart people who are reflecting on this question. So I thought that's my favorite.
Basically the whole book.
Yeah.
Whoever I did name, please know I was thinking of you. Like the 5 people who didn't get mentioned, please know you were also on my mind is my favorite. It's so good. It's good.
I would just add that, there's a piece in the book about folks who are fighting for Palestinian liberation. And we certainly were a little worried that this, the piece would become a point of contention. It wasn't. And Dima Khalidi from Palestine Legal actually rewrote it, because when she originally contributed, October, 7th, October hadn't happened. And then all of the backlash after that, she had to, update it. But I think it's also a really beautiful piece because it helps situate Palestinian liberation and Black liberation as intertwined. And I think sometimes in this kind of environment that might get lost. And so I'm really proud of that piece. I'm really proud of Marbré for helping to get it into the world, because it was, it took a lot of extra effort. And then the other thing I would add is that we very explicitly did a chapter on what we call frontline defenders for the revolution. So people who work at the public defender's office and at the legal service office, and who show up every single day in courtrooms with very little resources. And they have their own kind of commitment to movement, and they have the really hard job of being tacticians and really understanding these systems that are entrenched and rife with inequality and injustice, and also applying their radical politics and their desire to be inside of movement or to advance movement in these really hard and cold spaces of courtrooms and legal proceedings. I have the utmost respect for people who do that work, and I think they really get piled on sometimes, and get left out of the conversation about contributions to movement and contributions to abolition and to housing justice and to all of the things that we have said that we're fighting for. And so I love that chapter because it really is beautiful, and it really does help bring folks into the conversation that sometimes get missed or looked over. So those are some additional favorites.
Yeah, amazing. I guess my sort of like final question is about this political moment that we're in, which is such a moment of like retrenchment. And it does also feel like, in addition to the sort of like retrenchment and backlash, it is also like this administration is in a lot of ways using the law against us in a way that is, it's not as though that hasn't happened in the past, obviously, but like the vibes have changed, right? Like there's a little bit more sort of like an explicit mask off version of that kind of lawfare against our movements that feels real scary. And I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts about, like, I guess having this book come out in this time. How is it hitting people? How is it finding people? And are there things that you're kind of hoping to follow up on with this? Because I think that, like, I imagine some of these things have changed.
Ameca and I talked a lot about this because this book really was written over the course of 2 years. We wrote this book when we were both very pregnant with babies who are now like out here talking and dancing to Olivia Dean and like Bad Bunny out here. So like these are like, it's like, the book took a long time in part because there were so many hands, and we're so grateful for that. But I had a lot of, I think, anxiety and curiosity about the relevance of the book. I was like, when I got the copy, I was like, let me reread this and make sure that this still matters or is important. And I think especially the last half just is so, so relevant because if we are not learning from and building on the lessons of the last decade or more, which is really what the book is focused on, then we are completely lost. And I think, two thoughts about the moment. One is, I think there's different ways to think about this moment. My orientation to it is as an escalation, right? That this is not necessarily a rupture from what's come before, though it is a violent and scary and petrifying escalation. But that everything we're seeing, to your point, are the seeds of a bipartisan project that has been about capital and expanding the state and has been deeply violent in profound ways. And so we should understand, our response to this moment should build off of our response to past moments. That I think we saw this, I was listening to an interview with folks in Minneapolis who talked about the kind of roots of the deportation defense being in the Obama era, mass deportation era, that we have to understand the lessons of the last decade, and we have to scale them. We have to we gotta scale up because they've scaled up in some foundational ways. But I think that it would be a mistake for us to think that there isn't so much to like harvest from that. So I think that's one thing. Is I think the last half of the book especially is this like deep harvest, and I think the first half is this reminder that if your assessment isn't right about this moment, there's a real danger whether or not we resist authoritarianism for the time being, that if we're not clear on what the threat is, that it's a ticking time bomb, right? The other thing that I'll say on perhaps my version of optimism in these times is, I think I'm sure it was the New York Times, because they're always coming with my inspiration. But I think they were saying something about how scary it was that although in the past we've bombed people without reason and overthrown governments and done coups, at least we pretended it was for democracy. At least we were like, oh yeah, we're invading this country because of this human rights violation or because of whatever. And the New York Times was so horrified, like clutch your paws, then instead of saying it was for democracy, they were like, oh no, it's about the oil, right? And I think that's a sign of the times we're in, that the kind of the international order, this idea about, even like the amount of like grafting and corruption that's just on for display, we haven't seen since since the early 20th century, is different in some ways. But there's something about the masks off that I think gives us some power. Because for me, the fight, I think, there's some version vision of the win in this moment is that we defeat Trump and we get like, Joe Biden 2.0 or the next Kamala Harris, or we get like a return to normalcy. And even, honestly, even like listening to kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party, like an AOC, articulate a whole world vision, I'm like, this feels like a world vision that returns us to liberalism. It feels like a return to kind of mainstream democratic politics. And I think for many of us who have been in radical left movement, we think that what actually is necessary is a transformation of these systems. And it's very hard to transform systems that are hiding. It's hard to transform systems if you can't say, look how violent, look how incredibly disregarding of human life and the earth these systems are. That if you're hiding under the kind of co-opted language of equality or of opportunity or of international human rights or of, like democracy talk, that it's hard to name what's going on. And so I think one invitation of this moment, and it's not, what's that fight? Like, you don't get to decide the terrain of your liberation struggles. I would not choose this terrain if it was up to me. But now that we're here, I think that there's a benefit in how, like, the emperor has no clothes on. We can name these systems for that. We can name that actually this is the logical continuation of the kinds of deportation systems that Obama set up. This is the logical, like, kind of conclusion of the type of policing that we've seen since the slave patrol started policing. That all of this is the natural consequences of these systems that we have allowed for and at times been complicit in and certainly naturalized. And so I think that there is something about the masks off that you named that actually for us, we should think about how it's a strategic gift for us. I think the other quick thing I'll say is the other lesson that I think the book is really trying to convey and that I think is so important in this moment is that the law will not save us. That there's no way this ends with, even kind of all of the rhetoric around the tariffs victory in the Supreme Court, or like if we just win enough lawsuits or do, and it's like, it's important that we use the law to mitigate harm. The law and winning these lawsuits creates some distance and space. It helps insulate people. People are not being deported because of it. People are not in jail because of it. And if we want to actually see a world that's transformed in the image of the kind of equality, the kind of thriving, the kind of economic opportunity, the kind of ability for us to have a control over our bodies in this land that we want, the law will not get us there. And so I think that's a really important lesson of this book, that this moment is making so clear that we must use the law as a tool. But if we think the law is going to save us, I think our expectations should be very low about what exactly it can save.
Yeah. I know. I'm just like, gotta sit with that for a second because.
Word. I think you're both right that it's really just shining a light on the ugly parts of empire. I'm certainly not unaffected by things I see, but also my time at L4BL, my time working with movements, my time doing this work reminds me that like the people struggling for power, they are the answer. We can have faith in that. We know it's happening. I see it happening every day. I'm heartened often by that, even when I'm scared. But I don't think, to Marbré's point, we can go back to anything like what we had before. There is this like real interesting space where you're seeing all of these people who maybe weren't outside in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered or when Breonna Taylor was murdered, or even all of the people who were murdered by the police before. And you see the tactics that police use in our communities every day being utilized by federal forces. And I'm just like, well, who do you think they learned to do that on? How do you think they learned? I grew up in public housing in upstate New York. I've seen plenty of doors kicked in by the police with dogs looking for somebody, hoping to find drugs, completely just terrorizing folks who were seen as not human or that were deserving of less dignity. So part of me is angry and sad and upset. And part of me is like, yeah, but we have the tools and we have each other. And yes, we can sue those folks and get some space, but ultimately the people are going to get us free. And I believe in that deeply. And at my core, it brings me a lot of, comfort. And the other thing I would add to this, and we have this somewhere in the book, a quote from Miriam Kaba, and if we don't, we missed an opportunity here to talk about hope as a discipline, right? And it's not just passive. It's not just sitting and waiting for something to change. It is doing something every day to advance the liberation of people who you care for and who you see as tied to you and connected to you. And so if that means you go to your job every day and you resist a certain directive or a certain thing, or you defect because you're not going to enact certain atrocities on people, or if that means you bring water and food out to the street, or whatever that means for you, I think engaging in the work every day, even if it's a little bit, it really helps me feel like, oh, okay, I'm doing something, and this does matter to like the bigger, more collective struggle. But a lot of my hope comes from just knowing, from seeing, from watching people struggle and resist and get power. That's what I hang on to in times like this. And I think this book really brings together a bunch of voices of people who also believe in that.
Well, thank you both so much for making the time to talk about the book. Thank you for the book. I feel like it's a fantastic offering for our movements that, like, you know, it's one that I'm going to be coming back to, I think. So, yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank y'all for all the work y'all do.
Thank you.
My thanks again to Ameca and Marbré for joining me for this episode. Their book, Lawyering for Liberation, is available now from the University of California Press. We'll have links to find it in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. And of course, if you liked what you heard, please let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes, tell a friend, and rate and review the show wherever you listen in. Like listener Shanley Hopes, who writes that this show is, quote, one of the most delicious and nourishing meals in my weekly media diet. The practical wisdom and hyper-relevant guests provide clear case studies for each of us in the broader movement for social change. Each episode offers a doorway and orientation to a shared horizon that inspires the right questions for you to better see what we collectively need to win and how to make your next move. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.